Along with the University of Washington and the Crooks and other partners, we are working to hold a statewide mental health summit in the fall of 2017. Please join me in welcoming Todd and Laura Crooks to the stage.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. We'd like to share the story of our son, Chad. Chad was always a creative and really smart young man. He went to Aviation High School and completed his freshman year at Montana State University for engineering. After struggling at his first year of college, Chad decided to take a year off, even though he maintained focus to return to the university and ultimately to land a job at NASA. During that year, there was a day when Chad came home from work and asked if he could speak privately with me. He said he'd been hearing voices, but that now he was seeing creatures at the tops of buildings and they were following him, and he was scared. At that time, we didn't know what to do, so we called the crisis center for help. Eventually, Chad got plugged into some outpatient care for a couple of months, but then one day in March of just 2015, just a year and a half ago, Chad had his first psychotic break. During that episode, he said he'd been feeling like he needed to kill himself, to jump off a bridge just around the corner from our home. We quickly wrapped him up and took him to the University of Washington emergency room to get him admitted to their inpatient psychiatric unit. I remember so well that night, wrapping him up in the blanket, Todd riding in the back seat of the car so he wouldn't jump out, me in the front seat, coaching him that he needed to tell them he wouldn't make it through the night if they sent him home. Because I know when we got there, Chad would be Chad and he wouldn't want to bother anyone. If he didn't tell them everything, I knew that they would just attempt to stabilize him and send him home. And if they did that, we would lose him. He was admitted that night and spent his first week in psychiatric care. There, they focused on his depression and his suicidal ideation, understandably. They got him stabilized and sent him home. He was home for 4 days when he had a panic attack because his psychosis was not yet well managed. He felt like he couldn't breathe and that his heart was going to explode. It was so bad, we had to call the medics. They came, and he was admitted for a second time. This was the beginning of Chad's life with schizophrenia. During the 9 months of his journey, he had 2 more bouts of suicidal ideation where we had to ask his brothers to lock him in a room when we were on vacation, or when I needed to pull him out of a bathtub when he tried to drown himself, even though he was receiving outpatient care. But because mental health providers are overburdened and the system is fragmented, he fell through the cracks. Being a smart kid, he researched schizophrenia on the web and lost hope for his future. We advocated for Chad as best we could, but with him being over 18 and in a system with so many barriers, even with parents who were helping him to navigate his care, we came to an end in his fight. I remember the morning of January 21st like it was yesterday. I know many people say this about dates that are etched in their memories, and this is certainly true for me. It was 6:20 in the morning, and it had rained all night long. I was going into work early, and I was out in the living room when I heard a knock at the door. I opened it, and there stood 3 police officers asking if they could come in. I went in, and I woke up Todd. And when we came out into the living room, they said they had Chad. I remember thinking, well, okay, he has schizophrenia. He's a great kid, but people with schizophrenia get arrested, I guess, so this is our lot. I also remember thinking, Chad wouldn't hurt anyone, and I can't imagine what he had done. When I heard one of us ask, "You have Chad?" the officer said, "No, we have Chad's body." And that's when our world turned upside down.
We started to learn about the roadblocks to recovery before we even began learning about Chad's actual disease. As Chad laid on that gurney in the emergency department after his first break, it became clear he was going to be admitted to the psychiatric unit. Chad's first request was not for us to deliver personal effects or creature comforts to him, but for us to tell his two brothers and his sister that he was merely staying at a friend's house for a week or so. I remember that moment so clearly, and the realization that this was going to be much more complex than treating, say, a thyroid condition or a torn rotator cuff. So the first obstacle to care is the stigma around mental illness that manifests in prejudice, shame, and exclusion. Because of how pervasive it is, people like Chad, who eventually develop mental illness, often have already grown up with the misunderstanding that it's more of a weakness than an actual disease needing professional treatment. The insidious nature of mental illness stigma contributes to the estimate that only 1 in 5 that suffer from mental illness actually utilize or even have access to care for their disease. And there's another obstacle. As a society, we often ask those that suffer from mental illness to manage all aspects of their care, but most often they simply can't. Laura and I eventually recognized that. We even put systems into place to provide Chad a kind of wingman system at home to help keep him steered in the right direction. But even so, he would arrive for an appointment, but forget $2 for parking downtown. Or he would arrive and realize he was also scheduled for work at that same time, so he would go to work. As a result of his disease, he had tremendous difficulty prioritizing, let alone managing daily meds, refills, and appointment scheduling. What Chad really needed was proactive outreach and coordination. His providers absolutely worked to help him, but were too overstretched and under-resourced for Chad to find hope and safety when he most was vulnerable. Chad's story of his battle with mental illness ended on January 21st of this year. But that doesn't have to be the ending for others going forward. So through us, Chad's battle against mental illness has really just begun. That's what brings us here. Right, bud? Thank you.